There is a very convenient story you can tell yourself about why you don't post. A story that sounds calm and reasonable and even a little wise, because it says that you simply value privacy, that you are not interested in exhibition, that you prefer to live rather than to document. And perhaps there is indeed a thin and fragile layer of truth in that. But if you stay with this explanation a little longer than is comfortable, if you do not immediately rush to distract yourself from it, you may begin to notice another question slowly forming underneath it, a much more dangerous and much less flattering one, a question that does not accuse you loudly, but instead waits patiently until you are quiet enough to hear it. And that question is whether this silence is really freedom or whether it has gradually become a carefully organized form of avoidance. Because there is a difference, a very deep and very uncomfortable difference between not wanting to perform and not wanting to be seen, and most people never stay still long enough to honestly discover which one they are actually choosing. Since both can look exactly the same from the outside and both can hide behind the same calm and respectable explanations, while inside they are driven by completely different forces, one by a quiet confidence that does not need witnesses and the other by a quiet fear that cannot survive them. At first, everything feels simple and even slightly pleasant because you scroll and observe and watch other people turn their lives into fragments and captions and small announcements of existence, and you feel a certain distance from all of this, not necessarily contempt, but something like detachment. As if you were standing on a hill watching a city that never sleeps and telling yourself that you prefer the silence up here. And in that moment, the thought, "I don't need this," feels clean and controlled and almost noble, as if you have somehow stepped out of a trap that everyone else seems to accept without thinking. But control is a strange thing, because it very often disguises itself as wisdom. If you look more closely, and if you are honest in a way that is not designed to protect your self-image, you may start to notice that your life has slowly been organized around the idea of safety, around the idea of not being exposed to what you cannot manage, around the idea of not giving the world more access to you than you can regulate. And without any dramatic decision, without any clear moment where you said, "This is what I want," you begin to live a life that is extremely well hidden, not only from other people, but in some very important ways also from yourself. Because to show something real about yourself, not something polished and strategic and easily explainable, but something that is still unfinished and a little uncertain and not yet fully shaped, is to take a risk that is much deeper than most people like to admit, since to be seen is not only to be noticed, but to be interpreted. And to be interpreted is to lose control over the story. And for some nervous systems, this does not feel like a small inconvenience, but like standing in the open without armor, while 1,000 indifferent eyes quietly decide what you are allowed to be. So you stay slightly behind the glass where you can see everything and almost nothing can touch you, and you slowly become very good at watching other people live, at understanding their patterns, their performances, their rituals of showing and explaining themselves. And you tell yourself that you prefer it this way, that observation is safer than participation, that distance is clearer than involvement. But there is a quiet and almost invisible cost to this position. Because when you never allow anything of yourself to truly exist in the world, you also never let the world answer back. You never let life push against your ideas about who you are. And without that friction, your identity remains strangely weightless, as if it were always floating a little above the ground and never really standing on it, as if you were permanently rehearsing a life instead of actually inhabiting it. You might notice this in small and almost embarrassing moments, when someone asks you what you have been doing lately and your mind goes blank. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing was ever fully claimed, nothing was ever allowed to become something that could be pointed at without explanation, and your life begins to feel less like something that is happening and more like something that is constantly being prepared, like a rehearsal that somehow never turns into a performance, like a suitcase that is always packed but never actually taken anywhere. For many people who stay invisible, there is an old and quiet belief living somewhere in the background. A belief that says that if people really see you, not the idea of you and not the version you could theoretically become, but the actual, imperfect, unfinished version, they will not be impressed or shocked or even particularly disappointed. They will simply be underwhelmed, and so you manage the exposure carefully, choosing to show nothing instead of something that could be judged, choosing invisibility over the risk of being ordinary in public, choosing the comfort of being potential rather than the vulnerability of being real. And this is where the trap slowly closes, because potential always feels better than something that can be measured, and mystery always feels safer than clarity. But potential that is never expressed slowly turns into a kind of emotional debt, a feeling that your real life is always supposed to begin later, when you are better, when you are clearer, when you are finally ready, even though that moment never seems to come and quietly moves further away each year. You watch other people build imperfect lives in public. You watch them say the wrong things and survive it. You watch them try and fail and change and still remain visible. And somewhere inside you feel something that is not exactly envy, but something closer to longing. Not for their success, but for their permission to exist without being finished, for their strange and almost careless courage to be real before being ready. But you do not join them, because staying invisible has slowly stopped being something you do and has become something you are, something that feels as natural and unquestionable as the shape of your own name. And over time, you stop distinguishing between privacy and hiding, between depth and fear, between a conscious choice and a habit that has never been examined, and your world becomes very predictable and very controlled, and without you ever really deciding that this is what you want. Very small, not in a way that looks dramatic from the outside, but in a way that slowly reduces the number of things that can still surprise you. You might tell yourself that you are not interested in attention, but attention is not the same thing as presence, and being seen is not the same thing as being admired, and avoiding one often means quietly losing the other. Because there is a particular loneliness that does not come from being misunderstood, but from being fundamentally unknown, from never really being encountered in a way that allows another human being to respond to you rather than to an idea of you. People cannot meet you where you never arrive, and you cannot be loved where you never fully exist. So you remain in this strange half-life, watching and thinking and analyzing and feeling many complicated things in private, while rarely letting them cross into the world, and it feels safe. And it feels controlled, and it feels manageable, but safety, when it becomes the highest value, does not feel like peace. It feels like a quiet suffocation, like waiting, like postponing your own life, like standing in a doorway that you never quite stepped through. And the cruel irony is that the more you hide, the more you begin to believe that there is something about you that must be hidden. And at some point, you are no longer protecting yourself from the world, but protecting the world from yourself, from your uncertainty and your unfinishedness and your very human edges. And this does not come from humility, but from fear wearing the mask of depth. You start to confuse stillness with depth and distance with wisdom, and slowly you forget what it feels like to be surprised by your own actions, to do something before you have fully explained it to yourself, to exist in a way that is not completely controlled by the need to manage how you might be perceived. A life that is never risked is not deeply peaceful. It is deeply untouched, and untouched things do not grow. They only remain. And remaining is not the same as living, because living always leaves traces, always creates some form of friction, always involves the possibility of being seen in a way that you cannot fully predict or manage. And perhaps one day, in a quiet and almost ordinary moment, you will notice that you know a great deal about other people's lives and very little about what it feels like to stand inside your own, without armor and without hiding and without the quiet comfort of invisibility. And that realization will be more painful than any post ever could be, because at least rejection proves that you were there, at least misunderstanding proves that you were real. And at least being seen proves that your life was not only carefully preserved, but actually lived.